Two places in remote Australia that have never produced a satisfying explanation. One is a mountain in far north Queensland that has been swallowing people without a trace for over 150 years, defeating every search party sent in after them, and making sounds from inside the rock that geologists can explain, but that have never made the place feel less dangerous. The other appeared on a South Australian plateau overnight in 1998, carved into the earth by heavy machinery across 16 days without a single witness, and is still producing anonymous communications from someone who has never come forward. Most write-ups of Black Mountain list the disappearances and move on to the legend. Few stop to explain why finding someone there is so different from finding someone lost in ordinary bushland. Standard search procedure for a missing person relies on a handful of basic assumptions. People leave a trail, dogs can follow scent. A grid search on foot or from the air can usually rule an area in or out within a day or two. None of that holds at Black Mountain. The boulder field has no soil layer at all in most sections, which means no footprints, no disturbed ground, nothing for a tracker to read. The gaps between boulders extend downward into voids that searchers cannot see from above and frequently cannot access even with ropes, because removing one boulder to reach a void can shift the boulders around it. Police involved in past searches have described having to call off attempts entirely, not because they had exhausted the search area, but because continuing risked burying a rescuer alongside whoever they were looking for. Specialist caving equipment, the kind that can be lowered into a known vertical shaft, is frequently useless here because the voids inside Black Mountain are not single shafts, but a connected branching network with no reliable map and no two access points guaranteed to lead anywhere near each other. A missing person at Black Mountain is not simply hard to find. In a meaningful number of cases, they are structurally unfindable, sealed inside a formation that nobody, including trained search and rescue teams with the right equipment, can safely take apart. That single fact does more to explain the mountain's reputation than any ghost story attached to it. A place doesn't need to be supernatural to become legendary. It just needs to consistently defeat the normal process by which missing people get found. There is a detail about Black Mountain that gets mentioned constantly and explained rarely. The mountain makes noise. Locals living near it for generations have described hearing loud cracks, sometimes compared to gunfire or distant dynamite, coming from inside the rock pile with no visible cause, often loud enough to carry well beyond the boundary of the national park itself. The explanation, once you go looking for it, is mundane and slightly unsettling at the same time. Granite expands when it heats up under direct tropical sun and contracts sharply when a sudden downpour cools it. Do that often enough, for long enough, and individual boulders eventually fracture under the stress, sometimes violently enough to be heard from a significant distance. One local account collected decades ago described it plainly. In summer, when the rock gets very hot, a sudden cool downpour forces the boulders to contract, and occasionally the pressure is so great a boulder will explode, audible for miles like dynamite detonating. The same account notes pale, powdery patches scattered across the mountain's surface, marking the exact spots where a previous explosion had occurred, a kind of visible scar tissue left behind on the rock itself. What makes this detail worth dwelling on is not the explanation itself, but what it implies. The mountain is not a static, inert pile of rock sitting quietly in the landscape. It is still actively changing, still cracking, still rearranging its own internal structure, decades and centuries after the boulders first settled into place. Every loud crack from inside Black Mountain is a small reminder that the maze beneath the surface is not fixed. The voids a search team mapped last year may not be the same voids that exist today, which on its own is enough to explain why repeated searches of the same general area can produce completely different results. The wildlife that exists nowhere else. Here is something that almost never makes it into the disappearance stories, because it doesn't fit the tone. Black Mountain's boulder field is the only known habitat on Earth for 3 separate species. A frog, a skink, and a gecko, all found exclusively inside this one formation and nowhere else on the planet. Not even in superficially similar boulder fields elsewhere in Queensland. Researchers studying these species have to work the same terrain that has defeated search and rescue teams navigating into the gaps and crevices by hand, often at significant personal risk, to document animals whose entire global population may number in the low thousands. Fieldwork here means crawling into the same dark, narrow spaces that have swallowed missing people, except deliberately, repeatedly, in pursuit of a creature small enough to disappear into a crack barely wide enough for a human hand. The conditions that make the mountain so dangerous to humans, the absence of soil, the deep, stable, dark voids between boulders, the consistent internal temperature insulated from the tropical heat outside, are exactly the conditions that allowed these 3 species to evolve in total isolation, cut off from related populations elsewhere by terrain too hostile for almost anything else to cross. It is a strange kind of symmetry. The same physical structure responsible for swallowing missing people without a trace has also, over a much longer timescale, manufactured 3 entirely unique forms of life that exist nowhere else in the world. Danger and biodiversity, produced by the exact same pile of rock, neither one cancelling the other out. What the searchers actually found it is worth being specific about what little physical evidence the documented disappearances have ever produced, because the vagueness is part of what keeps the legend alive. In the case of the 2 cattlemen who went missing in 1882, one man eventually walked out alive but could not coherently explain where he had been or what had happened during the time he was gone. That detail tends to get told as evidence of something uncanny. Read differently, it describes a man who had likely been lost, dehydrated, and disoriented in extreme heat for an extended period, conditions well known to produce genuine memory gaps and confused, inconsistent recollection with no supernatural explanation required at all. In the 1928 case, the prospector's body was eventually recovered, along with his rifle, and a gunshot wound was noted, though the precise circumstances were never conclusively settled. A bushranger and his companions reportedly vanished into the boulder field rather than face capture, and the police search that followed found nothing, not bodies, not horses, not equipment. Whether that means the men successfully evaded the search, perished somewhere inaccessible, or something else happened entirely, is a question the existing record simply cannot answer with confidence either way. This is the genuinely uncomfortable part of the Black Mountain story. It is not that the evidence points towards something inexplicable. It is that the terrain itself is so effective at destroying or concealing evidence that in case after case, there simply isn't enough information left to draw any firm conclusion at all. The mystery isn't built on strange clues. It's built on the near total absence of clues, in a landscape almost perfectly designed to produce exactly that outcome. What the traditional owners have always said: strip away the modern retellings and the core warning embedded in the place predates all of them. The Kuku Yalanji name, Kalkajaka, translates as place of the spear, and the site has long been understood by traditional owners as carrying genuine spiritual danger, distinct in kind from other significant sites nearby. Traditional owners do not enter the formation. That is not framed as superstition by the people who hold that knowledge. It is framed as an accurate, tested understanding of a specific place, arrived at across a far longer span of time than any European account of the mountain has existed. What is striking, looking at the full picture, is how little daylight there actually is between that traditional position and what the physical evidence independently supports. The mountain is dangerous. People who enter it sometimes do not come back. And when they do, the terrain has frequently destroyed whatever evidence might explain what happened to them. Two entirely different ways of knowing. One carried in story across thousands of years. One built from 20th century police reports and geological surveys, arrived at functionally the same conclusion: stay out. Black Mountain does not need an invented explanation. It has a real one, built from granite, gravity, heat, and gaps deep enough to defeat anyone who goes looking. That happens to be more unsettling than a ghost story, not less, because it means the danger is permanent, ongoing, and entirely indifferent to whoever walks toward it next. Kilometres west of a South Australian outback town with a population of 150 people, something happened in the space of 16 days that has never been explained. A figure appeared on a remote plateau, not a small one. Not something you could dismiss as a scratch in the dirt or a trick of the light from an aircraft window. A figure 4.2 kilometres tall, with a perimeter of 28 kilometres, carved into the red earth with lines 35 metres wide and 30 centimetres deep, depicting an Aboriginal man hunting with a throwing stick. The figure is so large, it is visible from space. Not a single person saw it being made. This channel covers the strange, the unresolved, and the real history of Australia that most people never hear about. Subscribe now, because this one is still open. What the pilot saw. On June 26, 1998, a charter pilot named Trevor Wright was flying between the townships of Marree and Coober Pedy when the ground below him stopped making sense. Where the NASA Landsat satellite had photographed undisturbed desert on May 27th, less than a month before, there was now a massive human outline carved into the plateau beneath him. He flew lower to confirm what he was seeing. There was no ambiguity. A figure, proportioned correctly, anatomically detailed, unmistakably intentional, had appeared in one of the most remote stretches of desert in the country, between flights, without anyone apparently noticing the work that must have gone into producing it. Experts who subsequently examined the site concluded that the figure could only have been made using earth-moving machinery, specifically something comparable to a bulldozer or a grader operated with GPS guidance. In 1998, GPS technology was still in its infancy and was not widely available to civilians. The lines were too consistent, too precise, and too geometrically accurate to have been produced by any other means. When locals restored the fading geoglyph in 2016 using a modern GPS-guided construction grader, it took a professional team 5 days of sustained work to redraw the outline. The original would have taken, at minimum, the same amount of time in remote, harsh desert, with machinery that needed to be transported there, operated there, and removed afterward, all without a single local resident, aerial observer, or passing traveller noticing anything. The only track leading into and out of the site left no footprints, no tyre marks. Police investigated at the time and found nothing. The South Australian government temporarily closed the site. A reward of $5,000 was eventually offered by explorer Dick Smith for credible information about the creators. No credible information was ever provided. The Faxes and the jar. The morning after the discovery, anonymous faxes began arriving at hotels, pubs, and news outlets in the region. They described the figure, named it Stewart's Giant, after John McDowell Stewart, the first European to traverse Australia from south to north, and framed it as an homage to both Stewart's journey and to the Aboriginal people of the area. The language in the faxes was ODD to anyone who read them carefully. Distances were given in miles rather than kilometres. The Great Barrier Reef was referred to as the Queensland Barrier Reef. Aboriginal communities were described using the term Indigenous territories, not a phrase commonly used in Australia. The faxes read as if they had been written by someone American, or by someone going to considerable lengths to sound American. Shortly after the faxes arrived, a small glass jar was found buried in a freshly dug trough at the site. Inside was a satellite photograph of the figure and a note bearing a US flag. A second fax in January 1999 directed investigators to a buried plaque 5 metres south of the figure's nose. The plaque carried both an American flag and the Olympic rings, and bore a quotation about Aboriginal hunting techniques taken from a 1946 Australian book called The Red Centre. The quote had been selected from a specific section describing Pitjantjatjara hunters using throwing sticks. The figure itself appears to be holding a woomera, consistent with that tradition. Whether these clues were genuine evidence of the creator's identity, or an elaborate set of red herrings planted to mislead investigators, is still unknown. The government eventually announced it would not take legal action against the creators, even if they came forward. Nobody has. The main suspect. The person whose name appears most frequently in connection with the Marree Man is Bardius Goldberg, an artist who lived in Alice Springs and who died in 2002, aged 61. Goldberg was known for large-scale work inspired by Aboriginal culture and had on multiple occasions expressed an interest in creating art, so large it could be seen from significant height. Several of his friends have said in separate interviews over the years that he told them he was responsible. One friend said simply, if anyone was mad enough, talented enough, and cheeky enough to do it, it was Bardius. When investigators approached Goldberg directly during his lifetime, he neither confirmed nor denied the claim. He died without making any public statement on it. If Goldberg was responsible, the questions that remain are in some ways more interesting than the authorship itself. How did he finance the project? One rumour, never substantiated, suggested he received a payment of $10,000 from an Adelaide businessman. Why did he never claim credit, given that no law was broken? What was the connection to the American references in the Faxes, given that Goldberg was Australian? And how did someone move heavy earth-moving equipment across remote desert, operate it for days, and return without being seen by anyone in a region where unusual ground activity would have stood out? The restoration and the email. By 2013, the Marree Man had largely disappeared. 15 years of desert wind had eroded the lines until they were barely visible from satellite images. Local business owners decided to restore it. Using GPS coordinates from aerial surveys of the original, they hired a construction grader and began work in August 2016. Here is where the story adds another layer. Before the restoration was complete, the team received an anonymous email. It contained a detailed GPS file mapping the original Marree Man's outline with extraordinary precision, far more precisely than any aerial survey could provide. The email allowed the restoration team to accurately rebuild a figure they could not see from the ground. Whoever sent it had coordinates accurate enough to suggest either direct involvement in the original creation or access to highly detailed original survey data. The email was never traced. Nobody knows who sent it. Dick Smith, who had spent 2 years and significant resources trying to identify the creators, said publicly that the investigation hit a wall that could not be moved. The reward went unclaimed. What it depicts. The Marree Man depicts a male Aboriginal hunter in a standing pose, holding what appears to be a woomera in his left hand. The anatomy is accurate. The stance is consistent with hunting postures recorded in anthropological photography of the Pitjant Jatjara people, the same group described in the red centre quotation found on the buried plaque. Some researchers have noted that the figure's outline closely resembles, in reverse, the Artemision bronze, a famous ancient Greek statue of Zeus recovered from the Aegean Sea in 1928. Whether that resemblance is deliberate, coincidental, or a property of attempting to draw any male figure in a throwing stance has not been determined. The land on which the figure sits is Arabana country. The Arabana people were awarded native title to the area in a federal court decision in 2012. Some members of other communities had previously called for the geoglyph to be erased on the grounds that it represented an unauthorised intrusion onto sacred land, created without consultation. The Arabana people, under whose traditional ownership the land now sits, agreed to the 2016 restoration. The figure continues to be visible from the air. Scenic flights from Marree take visitors over it. Standing at ground level anywhere within the plateau, you would have no way of knowing it was there. The lines are only intelligible from a height of at least 1,000 metres. Whoever made it was designing exclusively for a view from above, on land where almost nobody goes, in a country where almost nobody would look unless they already knew where to find it. The South Australian outback has produced some of the strangest and least explicable things in modern Australian history. This is one of them. Subscribe if you want more, and let us know in the comments if you had ever heard of the Marree Man before today.